Yeah, today the topic is Indian philosophy, Vedas, and Upanishads. If you come here, I presume that you think of me as a person who invokes some interest. I have an appeal to make to all of you. If you like this talk, please consider making a small contribution to any charity or a cause of your choice. You need not inform me that you have made the contribution, but I shall be delighted if you do so. Now, let's come to the topic. Vedas and Upanishads were written sometime between, let's say, 2000 BC and 5000 BC. We must not forget that the time frame is identical to the time frame between us and the Gupta dynasty or the Kalabharas. Thus, both the Vedas and Upanishads cannot be viewed as works which speak in a unified voice. The other thing one should keep in mind is that the earliest available works in India are the Vedas and some of the older Upanishads. This is not contested by a single reputed historians. Of course, I am counting out the lunatics from some of the lunatics from Tamil Nadu anyway. The Vedas literally means knowledge. It means the ultimate knowledge for the religiously minded, but for others, it stands for a humongous body of compositions. The earliest of these are orally composed songs and praises by an almost pre-literate pastoral people. They were later transmitted to the succeeding generations by a method of sheer retentive memory. That's the reason why it is called the Shruti, that which is heard. All of us know that there are 4 Vedas, and the most important of them is the Rig Veda. Each Veda consists of 3 parts known as the mantras, the Brahmanas, and the Upanishads. The collection of mantras or the hymns is called the Samhita. The Brahmanas include the precepts and religious duties. The Upanishads and Aranyakas are the concluding portions of the Brahmanas which discuss philosophical problems. These came about much later, that's what most of the historians say. We must also not forget that there are several recensions of these Samhitas and a very few survive today. The only recension we have with us of Rig Veda contains about, I think, 1028 songs, and there are about 10,500 stanzas. These traditions attribute these hymns to different poets. However, as Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay says, these being the nature of primitive folk songs, it will be wrong for us to treat these as compositions of individual authors. It must have taken an immensely long time to have compiled them in the Rig Veda. With this introduction, let us peep into their world. What was their idea of this world and the sky above it? The Vedic hymns divide the universe into the sky, dew, and earth, Prithvi, and the middle realm, Antariksha. The word Deva literally means shining or luminous, and it is frequently used for gods. The gods are sometimes also called Asuras. Initially, the word referred to a powerful being. In later times, it came to become to be used exclusively in a negative sense for demons. The Rig Veda asserts that there are 33 gods associated with the sky, earth, and the intermediate region, but the actual numbers of deities mentioned in the text is more. Some gods are mentioned more often than others, but there's no fixed order or a fixed pantheon. Whichever deity is invoked in a particular hymn is spoken of as a supreme god. That deity is spoken of as a supreme god. Max Muller described this phenomenon as henotheism or cathenotheism. Henotheism or cathenotheism. In fact, it is exactly like the way we invoke our gods now. 2000 years ago, Vishnu was invoked as Veda Mudalvan Anba Thidara Valangiya Tigiriyone. Veda Mudalvan, the prime god in the Vedas. That's what our Sangam literature said. But today, Vinayaganai, whenever we worship Vinayagan Vinnukkum Mannukkum Nadanamam, that's what today's prayers also say. So whenever we invoke a god today, we shower them with praises and tell them they are, one. If you invoke one god, we tell them that we tell him or her that he or she is the prime deity. Shakti is a prime deity when we invoke her, or Vishnu, or Shiva, or Skanta. I can go on and on. So this is a clear Vedic tradition. Apart from gods, the Rig Veda mentions Gandharvas, Apsaras, and malevolent beings such as Rakshasas and Yatudanas, that is sorcerers, and Paishashas. Different ideas of how the world was created are also mentioned in passing. That is as a result of a great cosmic battle, the separation between heaven and earth, or the actions of gods. All these things are fine. Where does philosophy come in? Chattopadhyaya says this: except for some admittedly late hymns, which at best give the impression of cosmological speculations, and in which modern scholars are sometimes inclined to discover the germs of the Vedic philosophy, philosophical thinking is by no means the feature of the Rig Veda. Radhakrishnan, on the other hand, says the hymns are philosophical to the extent that they attempt to explain the mysteries of the world not by means of any superhuman insight or extraordinary revelation, but by the light of unaided reason. The mind revealed in the Vedic hymns is not of any one type. There were poetic souls who simply contemplated the beauties of the sky and the wonders of the earth and eased their musical source of the burden by composing hymns. While Chattopadhyaya is right in that most of the Samhitas are primitive and magical in the sense that they tell you that if you chanted a particular mantra, you would get a particular reward. Or if you chanted a particular mantra, your enemy would be vanquished. This is what Chattopadhyaya says is right to some extent, but it is quite difficult to dismiss the entire Rig Veda an arid desert, philosophically speaking, philosophy-wise. For instance, the Rig Veda speaks about Rita. The Rig Veda concept of Rita corresponds to the ancient Iranian concept of Asha. It refers to the order of the universe, the order of the sacrifice, and the moral order that human beings should adhere to. Some hymns refer to Varuna and Mitra as the guardians or furtherers of Vrita. In the later book, I think book number 10, I think, there's a dialogue hymn in which Yami appeals to her brother Yama. That is, the Yama is the first son of the sun, the first mortal man, and the king of the dead. We all know about Yama. Yami, she appeals to her brother Yama to commit incest with her in order to procreate. Yama rejects her overtures, stating that to do so would be contrary to Rita and to the ordinance of Mitra and Varuna. As Radhakrishan says, the Maruts, the storm gods, come from afar, from the seat of the Rita. Heaven and earth are what they are by reason of the Rita. The tendency towards the mystic conception of an unchanging reality shows its first signs here. The real is the unchanging law. What is, that is the present, is an unstable show, an imperfect copy. This is very important. The real is the unchanging law. The Rita is real, but what is changing is imperfect. It is only an unstable show. The real is one without parts and changes, while the many shifts and pass. Soon, this cosmic order becomes the settled will of a supreme God, the law of morality and righteousness as well. Even the gods cannot transgress it. We see in the conception of Vrita a development from the physical to the divine. Vrita originally meant the established root of the world, of the sun, moons, stars, morning and evening, day and night. Gradually, it became the path of morality to be followed by man and the law of righteousness observed even by gods. This is what Radhakrishan says. I think he is quite right. Let us now look at one of the most beautiful prayers. This is how Soma is invoked, where life is free, the third heaven of heavens, where the worlds are radiant, there make me immortal. Where life is free, the third heaven of heavens, where the world are radiant, there make me immortal. Where wishes and desires are, where the bowl of the bright Soma is, where there is food and rejoicing, there make me immortal. Where there is food and rejoicing, there make me immortal. Where there is happiness and delight, where joy and pleasure reside, where the desires of our desires are attained, there make me immortal. So, the poet says that in this world there is darkness, hunger, unfulfilled desires and wishes, tragedy and sadness. He knows that he is mortal, but he dreams of a different world where he will be immortal and where there will be radiance, happiness, delight, joy, pleasure, and all his desires will be fulfilled. He prays to Soma, perhaps at the peak of his intoxication after drinking Somarasa, to take him to that world. Thus, when each god is looked upon as a creator and granted the attributes of, let's say, Vishwakarma, maker of the world, or Prajapati, the lord of creatures, it is easy to drop the personal peculiarities and make a god of the common functions especially when the several gods are only cloudy and confused concepts and not real persons. The gradual idealization of the conception of God is revealed in the cult of Varuna. Thus, many gods gradually merged into a single supreme reality in the Upanishads. How did the Vedic philosophers view evil? First, a series of words indicate an external cause for all sorts of violence, harming, hurting, and afflicting. Here, the cause of evil comes from the outside. It encroaches upon us and hinder the happy and smooth development of our being. This is the evil which comes from outside. Okay, this evil is transcendental. Another set of words seem to denote an internal source. These words speak of anxiety, narrowness, lack of expansion, a feeling of imprisonment within oneself. Here the cause is within and seems to be inherent in our own nature. We cannot blame others but ourselves. These are two major views. Evil comes from outside and evil is within us. We would like to be different and yet we are not. Here the evil here is immanent, it is within us. A third set of words, most of them are compounds, that's what they say, seem to suggest that evil springs from misadjustment and malfunctioning of a system that otherwise is far from being bad. That is the change of, let's say, the tampering with the rhythm. These words postulate a kind of factual ambivalence in almost any human value, which can turn out to be either negative and mischievous or positive and beneficial. Evil here depends on the direction events and values take. You note this very, very clearly. This seed is there in Rig Veda itself. Okay. What is evil depends on events, the direction events and values take. The classic example is Arjuna's doubt, Okay. Whether killing a person is evil or not. Krishna clearly says it's not evil, The seed is here. That's what I am trying to, convey to you. The seed is there in Rig Veda. I will quote a few more verses to illustrate the sense of wonder and inquiry of the Vedic bards. There's one beautiful verse. Who has seen the firstborn? Someone asked. Who has seen the firstborn when he that had no bones bore him that has bones? Who has seen the firstborn when he that had no bones bore him that has bones? Where is the life, the blood, the self of the universe? Who went to ask of any who knew? This is the doubt the Vedas and Upanishads have. Now let's come to the famous, the Nashadiya hymn, There were neither non-existence nor existence then. There was neither the realm of face nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? Was there water bottomlessly deep? There was neither death nor immortality then. There was no distinguishing sign of night nor of day, that one breathes windless by his own impulse. Other than that, there was nothing beyond. It goes on and on and on, it goes like this. And then the last two things it says, who really knows Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is the creation? The God came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? It says the God came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? Whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not know. This is what the hymn says. Radhakrishnan summarizes. The hymns form the foundation of subsequent Indian thought. Okay. While the Brahmanas emphasize the sacrificial rituals shadowed forth in the hymns, the Upanishads carry out their philosophical suggestions. The theism of Bhagavad Gita is only an idealization of Varuna worship. The great doctrine of karma is yet in its infancy as Rita. The dualistic metaphysics of Sankhya is the logical development of the conception of Hiranyagarbha floating on the waters. The descriptions of the aesthetic conditions caused by the performance of sacrifice, or the singing of hymns, or the effects of the Soma juice, when we see the glories of the heavenly world, remind us of the yogic states of divine blessedness, where voices are heard and visions seen. Shorn of verbiage, this tells us that there is a discernible continuity between the Vedas on the one hand and the Upanishads and later work on the other. Radhakrishnan, I don't think Radhakrishnan is wrong. Before going into the Upanishads, let us discuss briefly the Purusha Sukta, the famous or notorious Purusha Sukta. The Rig Veda refers to the four classes and even explains them through a kind of cosmology which centered on the word Purusha. It can mean the self or simply person. But Rig Veda here characterizes Purusha as all that it has been and all that is yet to be. This is how Rig Veda characterizes Purusha. Thus, drawing a parallel between a single being and the whole cosmos. This is very, very important. This theme comes again and again and again, so you listen to me carefully. That is, Rig Veda here characterizes Purusha as all that it has been and all that is yet to be. Thus, drawing a parallel between a single being and the whole cosmos. The gods are said to have sacrificed Purusha, dividing it just as the priest would divide. The priest would cut up an animal. From Purusha were extracted various species of animals, including goats, cattle, and of course horses, as well as the four classes of humankind. When they apportioned Purusha, into how many parts did they arrange him? The Purusha Sukta says, what was his mouth? What is his two arms? What are said to be his two thighs, his 2 feet? The Brahman was his mouth. The Kshatriya was made his 2 arms. As to his thighs, that is what the Vaishya was. From his 2 feet, the Shudra was born. This is what the Purusha Sukta says. But the Sukta then goes further. It says that moon takes birth from the Purusha's mind and sun from his eyes. Indra and Agni descend from his mouth and from his vital breath. And from his vital breath air is born. The sky comes from his navel, the heavens from his head, the earth from his feet. Like the Shudra, the earth also comes from Purusha's feet, and quarters of space from his ears. The Sukta, the Purusha Sukta, presents an unmistakable single source to the birth of everything seen and unseen, born and unborn. It is this idea which gets expanded and analyzed in Upanishads and later Vedic schools. Now, let us turn to the Upanishads. The very word Upanishad, to sit down near someone, indicates that it involves a sort of confidential communication. Most Upanishads make no bones about the fact that one has to travel a great distance and spend a great deal of wealth to understand the wisdom contained in the Upanishads. It is in the Upanishads we start hearing two of the most famous words of Indian philosophy, Brahma and Atma. Brahman and Atma. We will keep hearing them from now onwards quite frequently. Again, since Upanishads were written and compiled over a long period, it is idle to expect unity in them. In fact, Bhandarkar clearly says that Upanishads teach not one but various systems must follow from the fact that they are compilations as Rigveda Samhita is. Someone has asked me about the Mahavakyas. Someone has asked me this question: what about Mahavakyas? See, like Prajnanam Brahma, Aham Atma Brahma, Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi. These are considered, I think, if I am not mistaken, these are considered the Mahavakyas of the Upanishads. And Advaita philosophy deals with it. We will speak about them in great detail when we come to the Advaita school of philosophy. Now, let me give you a few examples of how Upanishads approach the problem of existence and reality. Let us take Brihadaranyaka, the great forest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. In fact, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad consists of an extended analogy or even identification between the parts of a sacrificial horse and the parts of the cosmos, like the Purusha is, The head of the horse is the dawn. His body, Atman, is the ear. His back, the sky. His feet, the days and nights. His bones, the stars. His flesh, the clouds, and so on. The passage, in fact, concludes: when it yawns, lightning flashes. When it shakes itself, it thunders. When it urinates, it rains. Its neighing speech itself. The Upanishads, in fact, tell us that when we understand the parts and powers of horses and humans, we travel a path from microcosm to macrocosm. Let me say that, Perhaps studying the structure of animals and humans is a way, even the way, to uncover the hidden structure of all things. What it seems to say is, we are part of the whole, and the whole resides in us. The philosophical issues by which we seek to grasp the world around us are many times explained by way of dialogues in the Upanishads. Let us hear the dialogue between Yagyavalkya and Gargi, who are at the court of King Janaka. When Janaka announces his intention to discover who among them is the most learned, Yagyavalkya, of course, he steps forward. He is questioned by a series of rivals, and he reduces every one of them to silence. Interestingly, a lady is also allowed to join the debate, one of the several characters who appear in the Upanishads, and she takes full part in the debate. Her name is Gargi. She, of course, she questions Yagyavalkya twice. First, when she pursues them along a cosmological, regress. I will explain what a regress means. You pick your questions from the answer and continue forever without any useful result. You get my point? You pick your question. When someone answers you, you pick your question from that answer. That's what she does. For instance, people say that the world is woven upon or supported by water. But what supports water? Air, comes a reply. But then what supports air? And so on. Why are the suns and the stars, the realm of gods, until Yagyavalkya tells her to stop asking questions, lest her head shatter. Of course, she is very much impressed. Shortly thereafter, she declares that if Yagyavalkya can answer a further difficult line of questioning, he should be deemed invincible in debate. Her second inquiry also similar to the first, and elicits another regress of explanatory cosmic principles, but this time I should say the buck stops. Okay, he in fact he satisfies Gargi by telling her that all things are woven upon space. They are supported by space, and space upon that which can never perish, which is Brahman. That is, everything is woven upon or supported by Brahman. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is the oldest of the Upanishads, and it sets the tone for those that would follow, using the familiar as a map or as a template or as a tool to understand what is unfamiliar and unknown. This is the technique which they follow. That is, they quote the example of what is known to us to explain what is unknown and what is unfamiliar. As another of the oldest texts, the Chandogya Upanishads, puts it, you must surely have asked about that rule of substitution by which one hears what has not been heard before, thinks of what has not been thought of before, and perceives what has not been perceived before. What we are learning to perceive from such substitutions is an underlying grid of correspondences which match bodily parts and vital functions to the primary elements and celestial bodies. The ultimate ground for the correspondences is called the Brahman. It is a unifying cosmic principle whose role is described in the Kena Upanishad, that is, by whom Upanishads. Let me read the Kena Upanishad thing. Kena Upanishad says, by whom impelled, by whom compelled, does the mind soar forth? By whom impelled, by whom compelled, does the mind soar forth? By whom enjoined, does the breath march on as the first? By whom is this speech impelled? with which people speak. And who is the God that joins the sight and hearing? That which is the hearing behind hearing, the thinking behind thinking, the speech behind speech, the sight behind sight. It is also the breathing behind breathing. Freed completely from this, the wise become immortal. That is, if you realize all these things, the wise become immortal when they depart from this world. When one cannot see with one sight, by which one sees the sight itself. Learn that alone is Brahman and not what they hear venerate. This is what Kenopanishad says. You may notice that all these passages use the same, same taxonomy we have seen above, featuring breath, speech, hearing, sight, and thought. And notice, we must also notice, the Brahman is more than just one element in this net of correspondences. It is something more fundamental, a breathing behind breathing, unseen because it is by which one sees. Okay, am I clear? In Chandogya Upanishad, Uddalaka, he tells his son to fetch the fruit of a banyan tree. So, ask him to cut it open, find the seed, and cut open the seed. His son Swetaketu finds nothing inside. But Uddalaka tells him that within the seed is the finest essence, on account of which the banyan tree has grown. It is, he adds, the essence that constitutes the self of this whole world. That is the truth, that is the self. A single essence, an essence within an essence, unifies, integrates, and explains the whole. But this essence is also not visible, it is invisible. Now, let us come to the next one. We are talking about Brahma. Let us come to the next one. Atma. What is Atma? In Chandogya Upanishad, Indra and his friend, of course, they goes in search of understanding Atma, and he goes to Prajapati. Prajapati is the man who creates everything, who's the Prajapati. Prajapati tells him this, he says, look at yourself in a pan of water and let me know if there is anything you do not perceive about yourselves. See, during those days, glasses was not there, so he sees his reflection on water. So they looked into a pan of water. Prajapati asked him, what do you see? And they replied, sir, we see here our entire body, that is Atma, that is a perfect likeness down to the very hairs of the body, down to the very nails. Prajapati told them then, adorn yourself beautifully, dress well, spruce yourself up, and then look into a pan of mirror. So they adorned themselves beautifully, dressed well, spruced themselves up, and then looked into a pan of water. Prajapati asked him, what do you see? And they replied, sir, as the two of us are beautifully adorned, well dressed, and all spruced up, in exactly the same way are these, sir. That is our images. They are beautifully adorned, well dressed, and spruced up. That is the self, Prajapati says. That is the self. That is the immortal. That is the one free from fear. That is Brahman. Prajapati told him. And the two of them left with contented hearts. Seeing the two depart, Prajapati observed that they go without learning about the self, without discovering the self. But Indra, of course, is not so easily fooled. He quickly realizes that the reflected self cannot be that for which he seeks. For if a body can be made beautiful, so too can it become diseased, lame, and crippled. So he returns for further instruction. Prajapati again fops him off with silly explanations. Finally, after many attempts, many years in fact, Prajapati tells him this, the final answer. He says, the one who is aware, let me smell this, that is the self. The faculty of smell enables him to smell. The one who is aware, let me say this, that is the self. The faculty of speech enables him to speak. The one who is aware, let me listen to this, that is the self. The faculty of hearing enables him to hear. The one who is aware, let me think about this, that is the self. The mind is his divine faculty of sight. Prajapati here presents the self as that which underlies thought, speech and sensation. So he clearly defines this what self is. Another of the Upanishads uses the analogy of a chariot. The intellect is the charioteer, the mind the reins, the body the chariot itself, while the senses are the horses that pull the whole thing along. This is the Katha Upanishad. But that might suggest a more active understanding of the self than the one Prajapati puts forth. Strictly speaking, the self is the source of neither action nor will. It stands still, observing itself as it watches, as it hears and thinks. It is not merely the one who sees, not the one who decides to look, but the one who is aware of seeing, of looking. Yes, neither is it a detached or impassive self, disengaged from its own desires and action, because it is aware of itself even as it pursues them. There are several such explanations. In fact, there are several such explanations about self, but one which Yajnavalkya says that stands out. Now, what he says is, as a mass of salt has no distinctive core and substance, the whole thing is a single mass of flavor. So indeed, my dear, the self has no distinctive core or substance. The whole thing is a compact mass, gana, or cognition or pragyana. This brings us back to the point that the self is so hard to find precisely because it is always present to us. The phenomenal character of experience itself is barely noticeable, hidden as it is behind the false desires that come with our worldly concerns. That is, we cannot stand out and see ourselves. Is quite difficult. That is, let us give an example. If you are inside the big temple, inside the temple, you can't see the temple. You are outside the temple, you cannot see what is inside the temple. Let's imagine yourself as the temple. You imagine yourself as the temple. You cannot see yourself when you are inside it. But when you are outside it, you cannot see what is inside. Only the outer periphery, outer structures are visible. In fact, Yajnavalkya, there's a dialogue with Yajnavalkya which is very fantastic dialogue. Someone asked him, tell me, when a man dies and his speech disappears into fire, his breath into wind, his sight into the sun, his mind into the moon, his hearing into the quarters, his physical body into the earth, his Atma into space, the hair of his body into plants, the hair of his head into trees, and his blood and semen into water. What happens to the person? Yajnavalkya says, my friend, we cannot talk about this in public. Take my hand. Let us go inside. So they left and talked about it. And what did they talk about? They talk about nothing but karma. And what did they prize? They prized nothing but karma. Yagyavalkya told him, a man turns into something good by good action, into something bad by bad action. But interestingly, though this signifies karma, interestingly, rebirth is not a very common theme in the Upanishads. On the other hand, freedom, immortality, existence beyond death are mentioned very quite frequently. From the point of view of the classical form of the doctrine of karma, in which freedom is understood as a release from rebirth, this appears maybe slightly paradoxical. But Upanishads show many views of the ultimate freedom, the liberation or moksha. Again, let me resort to Yagyavalkya. He says that self is known in a dreamless sleep. When that man consisting of consciousness is conscious neither of objects in the external world, nor the objects we create for ourselves in dreams, but only of himself. He illustrates this with a sexual image. He says, as a man embraced by the woman he loves, does not know anything. A man embraced by a woman he loves does not know anything outside or within. Just so this man, embraced by the knowing self, does not know anything outside or within. Again, it's a very beautiful simile. As a man embraced by the woman he loves does not know anything outside or within. Just so this man, embraced by the knowing self, does not know anything outside or within. That is his form beyond sorrow, in which he has achieved his desire. The self is his desire. He has no other desire. He has no desire. This objectless consciousness, which is also extreme bliss, is identified as the world of Brahman, in what we experience in dreamless sleep. Unfortunately, we forget this blissful experience when we wake up or when we pass from dreamless sleep into dream. But Yagyavalkya uses similar terms to describe the person who after birth is free from rebirth. The one who does not desire, who is without desire, free from desire, who has achieved his desire, whose desire is the self, his breaths do not depart. Being Brahman itself, he goes to Brahman. This is what Yagyavalkya says. There's a verse about it. Let me tell you about that verse. When all the desires are abandoned, that's when all the desires are abandoned that were in his heart, then a mortal becomes immortal. He reaches Brahman in this world. As the slough of a snake might lie dead and discarded on an anthill, so this body lies. And bodiless, deathless life is nothing but splendor, nothing but Brahman. That is, bodiless, deathless life is nothing but splendor, nothing but Brahman. The knowledge that leads to liberation cannot be expressed in words, which is precisely what we are doing. In fact, Yagyavalkya says very clearly, having known it, that is, having known what self is, what Brahman is, having known it, a wise Brahmin should practice wisdom. A wise Brahmin should practice wisdom. He should not ponder many words, for that tires the wise. He says, keep quiet, don't prattle, which is precisely what I am doing. This is what Yagyavalkya says. To understand, what Brahman is, what life after death is. Now, let me summarize. So I come to the end of my talk. Let me summarize. The seeds of Indian philosophy are found in the Vedas. Later, they germinate into identifiable forms in the Upanishads. Brahman and Atma are used and discussed again and again in the Upanishads. What do they seek? In fact, Ambedkar says very beautifully. What do they seek? How did the world originate? In what manner were individual things created? Why have they their unity and existence? Who created and who ordained? From what did the world spring up, and to what again will it return? These are the basic questions that were being asked again and again by Vedic and Upanishadic philosophers. The answer they come out with is Brahma and Atma, and the ever-ending discussion and the relationship between the two. The 6 systems of the Hindu philosophy carry on these discussions in myriad ways. Now I realize that I have spoken, too many words, so I will stop here. And most probably my next topic will be materialism in Indian philosophy.